So you are stuck with me. And we'll take a minute before we get rolling, let folks start to join. We're going to have a great conversation today with an old friend of mine, Hady Amr. Hady is a real expert, especially on all things Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Especially Palestinian affairs. We'll also talk about some other issues, including experiences working on presidential campaigns, um, you know, and the experiences of Arab American appointees in various administrations, and some of the challenges and prejudices, frankly, they deal with. But Hady, welcome. The other thing I'll say before we really get started is Jeremy and I usually joke about how we're both wearing the same color shirt, so you clearly got the memo. You and I both, lack of hair is another, I think we're looking very similar here. So. Uh,
It's great to be with you, and I did put my collar stays in, Elon.
all right, that's fair. I do not have collar stays in, and we'll just maybe we'll share that with everyone. Hady and I share a mentor in the name of Martin Indyk, Ambassador Martin Indyk, who used to be a special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Hady and I both work for him at the State Department. The first time I went traveling with Martin, he showed up in the office that day. He looked at me. He pulled out a box full of collar stays and he said, "If you're going to travel with me, you're going to need to wear these." And that's been a thing ever since. But Martin obviously passed away last year, and we miss him very dearly. Um, but Hady, welcome. Thanks for
Pleasure.
joining us. For those who don't know who Hady is, Hady was special representative for Palestinian affairs at the State Department from 2022 to 2025. Really was the equivalent of our ambassador to the Palestinians. Before that, worked as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State on Israeli and Palestinian affairs early in the Biden administration, but has had a long career working on these issues. Hady and I worked together during Secretary Kerry's push on Israeli-Palestinian issues back in 2013 and 14. Hady afterwards was very much responsible for post-conflict reconstruction in Gaza after what we thought at the time was the most horrific conflict in Gaza, nothing compared to what we've seen since. And also just an old friend who we've done a lot of writing and working on together over the years, going back many 20 years. So, Hady, I've wanted to have you on the show for a while, and thrilled you are here.
Pleasure to be here.
And just a reminder before we get started for everyone, please restack all the things as you're watching the show. It helps us. But Hady, let's start by just talking about where we are right now. Obviously, a situation deteriorating in the West Bank. Progress on, I think, the next steps in the ceasefire in Gaza seems stalled. What's your overall assessment of where are we?
Well, you're if anyone's been watching your Substack and your podcast, you guys have the basics, right? We're in the land of Israel, Palestine. It's half Jewish, half Palestinian, but 90% of that land is under full Israeli control, and the remaining 10% is under partial Palestinian control. Look, I mean, after just these horrific years, over 1,000 Israelis killed on October 7th, and tens of thousands of Palestinians slaughtered in Gaza over a couple of years. I think everybody is relieved to have a pause in the killing. But the reality on the ground is incredibly tenuous, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where, settlement units, Israeli settlements in the West Bank are growing and expanding faster than ever before. Settlements are being approved faster than ever before. I don't want to throw all this data at you guys, but if you need it, it's there. Land is being seized, hundreds of Palestinian checkpoints, homes are being demolished, Palestinian homes are being demolished in the West Bank at hundreds, nearly 1,000 per year. Netanyahu's authorized the construction of E1, this new settlement in the West Bank, where Netanyahu himself said, "We're going to fulfill our promise that there will be no Palestinian state. This place belongs to us." Basically saying this settlement is there to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. And then just a couple of more points, and then I'll pause. Settler violence is also kind of at a painful high, and that violence comes with a purpose, right? And so there's been more than 80 Palestinian communities displaced. 14% of the West Bank in the last 2 years has become inaccessible. The years 23 and 24 were collectively the deadliest years for Palestinians in the West Bank, kind of on record in decades, as a collective 2 years, not each year, but as a 2-year period, and over 100 new outposts since October 7th. So it's been a really rough year in that regard, and I could go on and on, but let me just pause there.
Well, maybe let me ask you, Hady, one follow-up question, because we do have, we do have the ceasefire now and the situation in Gaza where it feels like negotiations are basically stuck. You do have somebody who's now responsible for this, and Nikolai Mladenov, who both you and I have dealt with in the past, who's a pretty effective guy. But it definitely feels like we are in a position now where everything hinges on Hamas disarming and no willingness to start anything on reconstruction, on rebuilding, on any other part of the process unless Hamas disarms. I wonder how you see that negotiation going, and if you think the U.S. is playing the right role here, or if there's something else we should be doing in terms of how we approach it.
Look, I mean, that's a, I was going to say it's $1 million question, but it's a multi-billion-dollar question, really, because the reconstruction process has not really started in earnest. Look, I think in Gaza, as in the case in Lebanon, it's hard to get groups like these to disarm. Mladenov is an incredibly effective a negotiator, politician. I've had the honor of sitting, side by side with him in numerous conversations. He's effective in Gaza. He's effective in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority. He's able to work with Israelis. He's able to work in the region and internationally. But I think we're at a tough place right now. I don't think there are any easy answers, and in many ways, the ceasefire itself that was negotiated, which included, right, these alleged, what we understand, right, were meetings with Jared Kushner, with Hamas, and Witkoff with Hamas directly. I think they kind of kicked the can down the road on all that, and I don't know if we're going to get there. I think that in many ways, it's Netanyahu clearly has stated he's opposed to the two-state solution, but I think what he does support is what I call the two-statelet solution, where the West Bank and Gaza are these weak Palestinian statelets that are kind of more like municipalities. And I just, Ilan, I don't know if we're going to get there. I don't know if we're going to get to Hamas disarmament. I don't know if we're going to get, back on the road to, Palestinian freedom. And I think it's going to be, it's a very difficult process ahead. I wish I had a solution here. I don't have an easy answer, unfortunately.
Well, maybe let's pivot the conversation a little bit to be even a little more meta, which is, like, you were the most senior official responsible for the relationship with the Palestinian Authority and really with the Palestinians. And also, probably out of all American officials, I'm not sure I know a former official or a current official who has a better set of relationships or understandings, like, with Palestinians and with Palestinian government officials than you do. And so one of the things we've been talking about here at J Street recently, and I just wrote a piece, and I know you wrote a piece recently. I wrote something with my colleague Liam Hamama, about the fact that, we're fixated on the U.S.-Israel relationship and on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but there's this third leg to this triangle, and it's the U.S.-Palestine relationship and how we think about that. Something that gets just such short shrift. I'm interested, how do you approach that or think about that? And what do we need to do going forward? How do we change where we've been in the past on this instead of just kind of putting it on the side?
Well, thanks. As you might imagine, I've thought about this a fair bit, and especially when I was asked to play that role in the prior administration. Um, Look, I mean, when I think about U.S.-Palestinian relations, and also really, Palestinian-Israeli relations, um, first you need to remember, like the U.S.-Palestinian diplomatic relations, in a sense, were launched in the mid 1800s, 100 years before the creation of Israel, when the consulate general was opened, in Jerusalem, with the Palestinian people. And so, in a sense, there's this long history, over 150 years of U.S.-Palestinian relations. But what's happened since then, is that, we fast forward a century to the 1940s, when the U.S. did vote, right, to create a Palestinian state and an Israeli state alongside each other. That Palestinian state never came into being. What was created in its place was UNRWA to take care of refugees. But we're now in a situation where there are a cumbersome set of US laws that limit and restrict the US Palestinian relationship going back to the 1980s, that were ostensibly created to kind of fight terrorism, a good thing. But in many ways, those laws, tie our hands behind our backs. And so, unless, we can kind of reform and shift the U.S. Palestinian relationship, it's going to be a problem not only, in the Trump administration, but really for any future U.S. administration, Democratic or Republican, because we don't have, an open channel. We don't have a Palestinian office in Washington, of the PLO or the state of Palestine. We don't have a, a kind of a U.S. consulate or even an Office of Palestinian Affairs, on the ground there that is consecrated to building out that U.S. Palestinian relationship. And it's hard to be an effective negotiator, problem solver, as the United States, unless we have those relationships that we can build out.
Yeah, one crazy example that I give to folks is we have a law from, I think it was 1987, which according to Congress still considers the PLO a terrorist organization. And yet member of Congress after member of Congress goes into the region, goes into Ramallah, meets with senior officials from the PLO. You and I, on a regular basis, when we are in government, you especially, always going in, meeting with senior officials in the PLO. And yet, according to Congress, all these people are still terrorists. So something doesn't make sense here. And they've long since recognized Israel and, renounced violence. And yet they're still considered terrorists according to these laws. But I do want, one of the things I've been thinking about, right, is how do we help, Palestinians actually build a state of their own, right? Get nation building. That's an important part of what the U.S. can do to help Palestinians, and we have in the past, when it's worked most effectively in the past, at least from my perspective, this was the piece we recently wrote. It's really been when you have Palestinian leadership that's both effective and legitimate in the eyes of their people, a challenge we have right now. We haven't had real elections in 20 years, although we can talk a little bit about the municipal elections a couple weeks ago. You actually have an Israeli government, not like the one right now, who wants to, like you said, go for two statelets and empower extremists like Hamas and give them lots of money, pass billions of dollars, as Netanyahu did through Ben Gurion Airport, to Hamas, while at the same time cutting off funds to the Palestinian Authority. And then you also need the international community invested in being able to do this. So you need to set these three conditions. And for me, that feels like where we need to go as we think about a strategy for the U.S.-Palestine relationship is how do you start building these things so you can actually put the Palestinians in a better position where they can actually have a state and have the right leadership and build the institutions they need, as opposed to saying, well, the PA stinks and so there's nothing we can do. We have no partner, which is where we've been for a while now. But, I wonder how you look at this, and especially, this question of legitimacy, which starts with elections and how hard it's been to do that over the past 20 years. Where do you come down on this question of Palestinian elections, the danger of Hamas taking over, and what we as the U.S. can do?
Look, I mean, I think, as I said, I think we need, I'll get to elections in just a quick second. I think we need reform on three fronts.
Mhm.
The first front is, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian people themselves are calling for, kind of internal reform. You need to reform the U.S.-Palestinian relationship we talked about, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe J Street has, tell me if I'm wrong, has
Yeah.
endorsed the U.S. recognition of a Palestinian state, which, if that's true, would help the United States leapfrog over some of these arcane laws. And we need to reform the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, which structurally makes it very difficult for the Palestinians themselves to leverage things moving forward. But absolutely, on elections, I think there's no, people talk about Palestinian reform in the United States. What is the vehicle that we use to reform and hold our elected officials accountable, or our government accountable? It's through elections at every level. The Palestinians have a really competent elections authority. They just held elections at local municipal elections, not only in the West Bank, but also even in one municipality in Gaza, which is kind of extraordinary when you think about the situation on the ground there. Um, you know, Palestinians were a little bit despondent, and they didn't participate in high numbers in those elections because they don't believe they'll necessarily lead to change. But absolutely, I think elections are the best way uh, to empower the Palestinian people to hold their government accountable. And I think we need to embrace that. We need to allow the Palestinian people to vote. We need to allow them to elect the people they see fit to elect, and then from there, we engage as we see fit. The United States might not like elected officials in certain other governments, but we deal with them as we see fit. And so I think we need to go through a process where the Palestinian people have elections. I've seen polling data that shows that still 2/3 of Palestinians do support a two-state solution if it can be created. Um, but I think we need to let them have elections, and we need to deal with it as we see as with whoever is elected appropriately. And obviously, if we don't like who's elected, we deal with that accordingly. And if we like who's elected, then we've got a partner to work with.
So what do you say to the argument that, well, you're just going to end up with Hamas elected and we're not going to be able to do anything with that, and terrorists taking over, extremists taking over West Bank as well as Gaza?
Look, I mean, it's a fair question. It's a tough question. I don't think after the last few years that Hamas is that popular. I also don't think, frankly, that Fatah is that popular. Abbas's party is that popular either. Um, I think we need to allow Palestinians need to be allowed to have their self-determination, to have elections, as is the case in other countries. I think there need to be commitments by those elected to, for example, renounce violence. And once upon a time, I think in the Israeli system, there have been candidates that have been disqualified for espousing violence. It's not clear to me that those restrictions are in place today with some of the folks in the Israeli government. But I think if that basic commitment is kept, um, that the Palestinian people can have elections. They can elect, a government that we can work with. And if we don't love it, we don't have to work closely with it. It can be contained.
Yeah, and I'll just say two things on this. One is I'm totally with you on this. There's these ideas out there that any Palestinian who wants to run needs to recognize Israel and also, abide by all the agreements that were made in Oslo. And I kind of feel like at this point, Israeli government sure is not meeting that objective and criteria. So for me, all of that seems, it's not necessarily reflective of where Palestinian society is. Now, on the other hand, violence is a different thing. And so in my mind, that's the criteria to focus on. You have to be, if you're going to the ballot box, you have to commit to respect the outcome and not then turn to violence to get what you want otherwise. And so that to me is the measure that makes the most sense. The other thing is I do think the US does have an important role here in that, look, the last time I think Abbas seriously considered national elections, he came to Washington. It was early in the Biden administration. I mean, I don't know how serious he was or if he ever was going to do it or not, but he did look to us a little bit. And I think at the time, the decision was like, and we need to stop doing we just need to actually embrace this and take the jump. I don't think things can get much worse than they already are. So we might as well see what happens.
I agree. Look, Abbas did not come to Washington, but they
Oh, yeah,
certainly, because it
true.
was COVID,
Yeah, yeah.
and
I guess his people, some of his people came to
well, but
watch.
it was communicated. Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of the last administration, um, they did announce that they wanted to hold elections in May. There clearly wasn't a lot of enthusiasm in Jerusalem. I think there was wariness in Washington as well. Um, I don't have a time machine, but if I did have a time machine, I would love to have seen those elections take place. Um, I I believe had they taken place, it would have set us on a path whereby we would have avoided what's now been erased, but the kind of the May 2021, Israel Gaza war, which we thought was a terrible thing, and I worked on, and we all worked on together, kind of wrapping, kind of containing in a matter of days and not weeks or months or years. Um, and I think we might have been on a pathway. Look, I don't have a time machine, but I think that had the Palestinian people felt there was a pathway to liberation, to freedom, to two states, we might have been in a place where even October 7th might not have happened.
Yeah, I want to ask you another question because another kind of thing that comes up on this on elections and Palestinian governance is they're all corrupt and there's no competent leadership. And we had Salam Fayyad, who, I really like and was quite effective 15 years ago. And we just have to go back there and there's no other options. And so there's nothing to do right now. There is no partner. How do you go to that? And what do you think of the current, especially the current prime minister and some of the people around him, which came in about a year and a half ago, and the way they've been running things?
I think it's actually been 2 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
time has flown. But look, again, without elections to hold the government accountable, you know, without that accountability, governments kind of do what they do, so that they need elections. But look, we have a Palestinian government that has, committed to the World Bank and the European Union a framework of reforms that they're undertaking. That, by the way, these are reforms that the Palestinian people, many themselves want to see. Wealth, healthcare reform, um, uh, uh, social sector, social service reform. So they need that. But there is a partner that we can work with. But what that partner needs to have, in many sense, is they need to have elections that hold them accountable. They need to do more in terms of having independence of the judiciary. And the other thing they need to have is they need to have direct access to their tax revenue, right? So we're in this crazy situation where, because of the Oslo Accords and the agreements called the Paris Protocols, which were signed a year later, that govern the Israeli-Palestinian economic relationship, the majority of Palestinian tax revenues are actually collected by the government of Israel and transferred to the Palestinian Authority. And so without access to those funds, the Palestinian Authority literally can't pay their bills. Their government workers have been without salaries. They're like a year behind in their salaries. There's $5 billion that Israel has withheld from the Palestinian Authority over the last 2 years, that should be funneling and fueling the Palestinian government and the Palestinian economic system, and they haven't had access to that money. And that, I'll just say, right, the fact that Israel is able to turn the spigots on or off kind of eliminates any ability for the Palestinian Authority to have kind of its own independence and its own legitimacy in front of its people.
Yeah, I mean, this I think is something that's totally nuts, and that, yes, again, I think there's been a history of poor leadership and governance, but these things are a function of something, right? And show me a government that can work and be effective and lead for its people when more than half its budget is just not under its control and is turned on and off willy-nilly. It's crazy. And when you have at this point, Bezalel Smotrich, who's extremist in the Israeli government, controlling all these funds as the finance minister, and just essentially making it impossible for the PA to function. So, yes, the Palestinians have to do work on a lot of things. Yes, or at least their government does. I agree. The PA is not the total model, but people just like to take shots at the PA. But like, show me a government that could actually function without its budget. So I think I have a couple of things that I think we need to dive deeper in maybe in future discussions and really need to think about. But one is, if Israel is just going to withhold all this money, I don't know why, and really sabotage this. There's economic levers that the US can push. Like, why does Israel need to be in a free trade agreement with the United States at a time where the same finance ministry that's responsible for a lot of that is just fundamentally sabotaging the Palestinians? Just an idea, right?
Right. So, no, sorry to cut you, but absolutely leverage is essential, right? So without leverage, things will not change. And so, um, but absolutely, I mean, we need to end the Israeli control of Palestinian government funds, right? You just can't. The Palestinian Authority has all the downsides of being in a government. They're held accountable by their citizens, and they don't have sovereignty over the land. They don't have sovereignty over their borders. They don't even have sovereignty over their income. And so you've got this $5 billion that Israel has seized from the PA that needs to be kind of restored to them. I think that we need to end Israeli control over Palestinian funds. There are other ideas being floated in conversations that I'm having with former senior, the head of the Palestinian Monetary Authority and others that are talking about maybe creating a digital Palestinian currency, launching it in Gaza where it's needed, and maybe transferring it from the West Bank that would kind of end all of those currency restrictions that happen. And yeah, I mean, and then there's so much more, right, in terms of freedom of movement, the two-tiered legal system in the West Bank. These are all kind of critical issues that if addressed, could enable the growth of a productive, effective Palestinian governance.
Yeah. So, I mean, in my mind, those are the two most important things. And I want to move on to the next topic of conversation. But it is, that first bucket of issues, which is you got to get some legitimacy inside the Palestinian Authority again through elections, recognition of a Palestinian state, infusing some hope in there, because you do need that, and reform, all those things. And then separate from that is none of that works if the Israelis don't cooperate on these other issues. And so it's time to start using some leverage. Also, for example, on the idea of freedom of movement, Israel is now part of the visa waiver program. Why should Israelis be able to just come into the US without a visa when, especially since October 7th, you've had this now for 2 years, inability for Palestinians to move almost anywhere in the West Bank while you have settlers expanding it at insane rates. I think there's 2 points of leverage. Everybody fixates on the arms, the arms, the arms. But I think there's a lot of points of leverage, and some of them are just, if not more meaningful, and matter more to Israelis and to Israel, but also are more directly tied to specific. The more you can just draw a clear linkage between a benefit and a change and a pressure point and what you're trying to pressure, I think the better off you are.
That's absolutely right. Palestinians need freedom of movement, and we need to use our leverage to get there. And I think you've heard me say this before, but I'm a real believer that like the international community needs to make a commitment, what I call action until equality, which for me means we're going to continue to take action until the Jewish people and the Palestinian people in the Holy Land can enjoy more equal lives. And we're going to take the actions we need to get there so that the Jewish people and the Palestinian people can both enjoy freedom, security, and the prosperity that they want to see.
So I want to shift this, Hattie, to a couple of other topics. Because in addition to both you and I having worked on Israeli-Palestinian issues for a long time, we've also both had different moments in our careers where we've ended up on presidential campaigns. You've done a lot of work with the Arab American community and the Muslim American community. You worked full time on the Gore campaign on these issues in 2000. You were one of President Obama's chief surrogates into the American Muslim community in 2008. You also worked on this for Biden. You and I worked together like for Warren for a little while on these issues too. And I did it from the Jewish side. And um, I am interested. I know this is something you care about. Where do you see, the Arab and Muslim American community today, especially in the aftermath of what's happened in Gaza, and the horror of Gaza? Like what has that done, and where do politics and the community lie right now?
Those are great questions, and you're right. And one of the things I'm most proud of in the years that we did together was the work we did on Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign and helping shape and craft her language as she talked about Israeli and Palestinian issues early on, grounding it in equality and wanting the same things for Israelis and Palestinians. I think there is a 100% an opportunity right now for Arab and Muslim Americans and the Jewish community to work together. I think, in many ways, we all want the same things for the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, which is safety, security, freedom, prosperity, and self-determination. But look, people are in a very painful place. And it's not only Palestinian Americans. And I need to say not and Lebanese Americans who have
Yeah.
seen whole swaths of community destroyed, in many cases deliberately, especially what's going on now in South Lebanon with the deliberate destruction of entire villages, and the trying to literally create a zone cleansed of Lebanese. So I think there's an opportunity for the Jewish community and the Arab, Muslim, Palestinian community to increasingly work together around a foreign policy that's grounded in American values, the American values of equal rights, human rights, and self-determination. There doesn't have to be full agreement on everything, but if we can agree on those basic values, I think that there's real ground to work together. And what I've seen, as I'm like my family and I moved to Virginia half a century ago, 50 years ago. I live in the home that I grew up in. I found that when engaging in local politics here in Virginia, that when Jewish Americans and Arab, Muslim, Palestinian Americans stand together, politicians really take notice and listen to the advocacy based on these kind of American values and universal values.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things you and I have tried to do together in the past sometimes. We don't like, we don't like wear it all over our sleeves, but when you and I work together and write a report, and go up to the Hill and brief members, like people notice, they know like what our general backgrounds are, and that makes a difference. It's not the core, but just like at our own personal level, it's that kind of partnership really works. It is, I will say it feels harder now than it might have been in the past in some ways. I think there's opportunity and I want to get back to doing more of it. There's also a lot of trauma, on both sides. And I felt that certainly in the 2024 campaign. I think, and for folks giving you a little bit of access, I mean, it's always true on these campaigns that the director for Jewish outreach and the director for Arab and Muslim American outreach end up spending a lot of time talking to each other, and trying to figure out how to communicate something that, says has to be consistent, right? On these issues, but also, look, these two communities and parts of these communities want to hear very, very different things. And so how you bridge that is very, very hard. And I think that was always true. But I think after October 7th and after, Gaza, it feels even more true. I look, we obviously made some mistakes in the Harris campaign. The most significant regret I have is that we did not I've talked about this before on the show, and otherwise that we didn't have a Palestinian American speaker at the, at the convention. That was my first week on the job, so I had zero say over that one. I tell folks, but at the same time, look, Kamala Harris has talked about that being a mistake. But I do think it's just this is really hard, and there's definitely a lot of pressure in different communities to not have that kind of work together.
Ilan, there's two couple things I want to say on that. So first of all, I'm really glad you used the word trauma, because I think both of these communities have experienced just deep trauma historically, right? Recent and historic, right? So the whole, whole ages of anti-Semitism, World War II, the attacks on Israel, October 7th, on the Jewish side, and on the Palestinian side, occupation, displacement, Gaza, the attacks on Gaza, ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And so it reminds me of I think a short piece you and I wrote for Foreign Policy. I can't believe it, but it's probably been about 7 or 8 years ago, where we talked about that peace over there requires acknowledgement of that severe trauma. It requires mutual recognition of both people's attachment to all the land, and it requires a commitment to equal freedom, security, and prosperity for both. But translating that back to the United States, I think there's more opportunity than ever. I think Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and Palestinian Americans want to just see, they want to see a U.S. foreign policy grounded in fairness, grounded in equal rights, grounded in American values. And I think that's also what, large swaths of the Jewish community want to see as well. And so in many ways, I think you're saying maybe it's tougher now. I think it's actually, there's a wide opening that if we can agree on these core values, there's a huge basis to work together, across these communities, to build coalitions, and to advocate for, if it's true that we all want these same things, right? Freedom, security, prosperity, self-determination for the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, then we can advocate for policies that build towards those things. And so it's really, there are these terms out there, so I think if we're advocating based on that, I think there's a real grounds for working together.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I know that that's what I want, and I also know that it's what you want, and I also know that that's what a lot of our viewers and watchers want, and so and we're going to keep working on it. And it's one thing that J Street does. We find ways wherever we can to work with partner, you know, Arab American and Muslim American organizations, on issues where we care about common issues, especially. And look, one of the biggest opportunities, and where we also focus a great deal of energy, is on issues of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that both of our communities are experiencing. And they kind of go back to the basic way that American Jews have long fought anti-Semitism in this country, and have long believed that the most effective way to do that is to fight it in unison with other, underrepresented groups and minorities who are fighting it too, because the same person who's an Islamophobe is very likely to be the same person who's an anti-Semite, is very likely to be the same person who's a racist. Those things all, there's such a heavy overlap, and by building together and uniting, our communities can be much stronger together than we are apart. And that goes back to, American Jewish, roles in things like the civil rights movement. So really getting back to that is something we think is really vital at J Street, and we find ways to do whenever we can.
I'm pretty sure you meant it, but I think in addition to Islamophobia, just kind of also labeling it as anti-Palestinian racism, right?
Yep.
Because Palestinian Christian, half of the Palestinian American community is Christian, the other half is Muslim. Those Palestinian American Christians feel, the same anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, it's kind of it's all wrapped together. So I think it's just important for viewers to understand that, that there is this kind of anti-Palestinianism or anti-Palestinian racism that is kind of out there.
No, fair, fair. And I stand corrected on
No,
that
no,
one.
you're not corrected. I'm just
No,
adding a nuance. You were
yeah,
using a term
yeah.
that I think it also includes that. So I knew what was your intent was. I was just
Yeah.
clarifying it for the
No,
record.
I know. I was just not being exact enough with my words. But
Exactly.
but it actually takes us into the last thing I really wanted to talk to you about, right? Which and it actually is examples of anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Arab racism, which is one of the things you and I have talked about for a long time is, that you are, Arab Americans serving in government, Palestinian Americans serving in government, Muslim Americans serving in government. I mean, it's a newer community to the United States in some ways, and you've had, this is happening now, thankfully in bigger numbers every time. I think we had more, in the Biden administration than any other previous administration, although also very well documented the struggles there once the war, in Gaza started. But you've been at this for a while. You're like one of the old hats and one of the originals. I know you pride yourself on that and trying to mentor others, but we do see a lot of something that just drives me crazy is kind of this extra targeting of, folks like you, folks like our friend Maher Bitar, who just started this week, at running a new organization or an old organization, but Maher that's being really rekindled, National Security Action. And our Trump's former ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, you know, uh, went out and tweeted about Maher and said he's a Palestinian himself. Like, could you imagine somebody saying that about a Jew? Like,
No, I mean it's
I mean,
it's
like,
horrifying. Yeah, and I was really so heartbroken to see that. And the ambassador that you reference has also attacked, both Maher and I in his writing side by side. You're right. I have been at this for a while, and I've been working at the intersection of Israeli-Palestinian issues and electoral politics for 38 years, believe it or not. And when I started, and I should clarify for viewers, I'm not Palestinian American. My ancestry is from Lebanon. I'm Muslim American. Not Palestinian myself, but I started in working in this space in when I graduated from college in 1988. And when I got to DC in 1994, and when I joined, late in the Clinton administration, I really was, in most rooms I was in, one of the only Arab Americans or American Muslims in the room, right? And there were others that certainly came before me, folks that that you might want to have conversations with, like George Salem on the Republican side and Jim Zogby on the Democratic side, that were getting involved in the space in the late 70s and early 1980s. But yeah, when I graduated from college in 88, there were no apparent Arab or Muslim, senior U.S. officials that I could point to, and I had to kind of find my own way. And the most innocent dimension of this is that there were no uncles or cousins to look up to or open doors to, and so you had to figure it out for yourself. There's an extra burden when you're the only one in the room of that background, that you feel like all eyes are on you and all the pressure is on you. So it kind of makes things difficult. But as you said, I've been working this for a long time. I've persevered. Two little data points that might be of interest: when George Bush became president in 2001, and I was exiting the Clinton administration, I talked to a friend of mine and I said, we should try to get together all the Arab American, political appointees, and government folks, and have a breakfast, just to, have kind of a little, because when you're out of government, you have a little kind of self-help group. We literally could only identify a half dozen Arab Americans on the one hand, and we had a kind of a separate breakfast for American Muslims that were political appointees, also only a half dozen. So there were just these microscopic numbers of members of these communities, just 25 years ago. Fast forward to, and it kind of gradually built up to the prior administration, where by my count, there were over 100 Arab American Muslim political appointees in the last administration, and about 45 or 50 Arab American political appointees that are actually kind of getting to the proportions of the US population that are about kind of average. And so this community has gone on this dramatic journey where they really were not at the table, to a point now where, at least in the prior administration, I don't know what the case is in the Trump administration, the community was represented, sort of proportional to its population. Now, the last thing I'll say on that point is, the communities were not represented at the highest tiers of government, I think, really at all. And but it's a journey, and I think it's a journey that will be completed to its proper, manifestation in the years to come. But there's really been this incredible journey over the last 25 years, where 25 years ago the community pretty much was not there at all, save a handful of individuals, and a couple of years ago it was represented, at least at mid levels that you and I served at. Um, at proportional levels for the first time in American history.
So that's actually very heartening to hear, Hattie, and I like that you're putting the positive element. I'm gonna like do one thing and just talk about, because for me, as so much of it comes from, frankly, elements in the for sort of far right Jewish community, and there's an overlap here. The amount of crap that gets thrown at you, at appointees who come from this background, the stories that get written about them, the images that are used about them are just completely beyond the pale and go beyond anything that I experience. And if I were to experience anything like that, then immediately people would be out there all over it talking about overt anti-Semitism. And for folks like you, it just drives me absolutely up a wall. And it's one of the things that makes me just so angry. This David Friedman experience with this tweet about Maher the other day, just being the latest example. But I could just, there's so many examples of this, and I felt it really during the presidential campaign, where there was just all these conspiracy theory stories about so and so is going to run this for Kamala Harris or run that for Kamala Harris. And the only thing they had on that person was that they were an Arab American, and maybe they said something when they were like 20 years old. That might have been, you know what? When I was 20 years old, or when I was in high school, I was a member of an organization called Young Judea, right? A like pretty right-wing Zionist organization. If you want to take back and look at what I was saying then, and say like now you're disqualified from ever working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or ever weighing in on these issues because of what your opinions were, because of the community you grew up with, because of the politics you were exposed to as a kid, and now we're going to just take that and make you, it's infuriating, and it's weaponized, and it keeps being done again and again and again. And frankly, it's mostly American Jews who are doing it, on the right. And so you don't have to say that. Like, I can say that, and I feel very strongly about it. And, it drives me completely up a wall. Almost nothing makes me angrier. And actually, what makes me even more angry is when kind of the people who are a step beyond the crazy right wingers who are doing this and are kind of your more reasonable folks who are establishment, and they just take it and they launder it just a little bit and throw it out there and take some of the edges off. But they're still basing it on that, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim racism. And they can launder it all they want and say it's just questions, but it's really, beyond the pale. And just another thing, folks have to overcome when they want to serve in government and take a position of leadership and service and making sacrifice.
Well, Ilan, thank you for acknowledging that. And again, I don't like to wear that stuff on my sleeve, but
Yeah.
it's absolutely true. As you know well, it's happened to me throughout my career, including, I'm remembering back to when I joined Al Gore's presidential campaign at a certain level, and normally a press release would go out when someone joined at this kind of director level, and for some reason, they kind of, my press release would never go out, where all my colleagues, never did. Now that doesn't, it's annoying, it's bothersome, what it's based on, but you've got to persevere. And I think, communities that face these challenges and that kind of discrimination, you unfortunately get used to persevering through that. But I will say, it's overcoming that perseverance, um, building partnership with people from other communities like yourself, that makes it kind of all the more meaningful to kind of persevere. But you're right, it doesn't make America stronger to have groups, kept out or attacked, based on their character. And one of the most heartening things for me was when in 2021, in January, when I was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs, 5 years ago, and I did receive these, attacks, and there were these caricatures with hook-nosed caricatures that, if applied to somebody else, would certainly be labeled in a certain manner, right? What was really heartening for me was that so many people like yourself, like our friend Tamara Wittes, like our former, boss Martin Indyk, kind of just rushing to kind of my defense and saying, not necessarily on a policy basis, just on a human basis, and saying, you know, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans deserve the same seat at the table that all other Americans deserve, and we as American Jews need should be, we as individuals are, but the Jewish community should be extra sensitive to that, because we faced that same discrimination decades ago. And so, I remember Martin and Tammy, not only to me personally, but making, public statements saying, because of the discrimination that our community has faced in the past, it's incumbent upon us to help this other community overcome its discrimination, the discrimination that it faces. But anyway, Ilan, I thank you for recognizing that, and for your partnership. And I really believe, again, I'm guessing we're coming to the end of this conversation, that we are stronger together, and that as especially we're especially stronger together if we espouse, the kind of the universal American values articulated in our Declaration of Independence, which that we're all created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain, inherent things, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that's a value that we can enable us to work together here in the United States, and also enables us to can articulate a foreign policy based on, aspirations for equal rights and equal outcomes for the Jewish people and the Palestinian people in the Middle East.
Awesome. Well, that seems like a very good way to end. So, Hady, I want to thank you again for joining us. I'm glad we finally did this. I know you and I have been tossing this around for a while. And thank you everyone who came on the show and joined us. Again, give us a like or a restack. It helps others find us and expand J Street's viewership. And I think next week we'll see you all next week. I'm not 100% sure exactly what's on tap, but I'm sure it'll be something interesting. And that's it. Thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure to be with you all.
All right.